The people who call you broken are often the ones most afraid of what they might see if you were ever allowed into the light. Grace Miller had heard those words only once, whispered by her grandmother years before illness carried the old woman beyond the reach of every full moon. Since then, no one had spoken to Grace as though she possessed anything worth saving. In the Miller estate, tucked between towering pines and rolling hills that stretched for miles across the Northern Territories, Grace had become a carefully hidden secret. At 22 years old, she was never introduced to honored guests, never invited to family celebrations, and never permitted to stand beside her relatives during pack ceremonies. Whenever visitors arrived, her stepmother, Margaret Miller, would straighten the expensive lace on her daughter Vanessa's dress before turning toward Grace with the same cold instruction she had repeated for years. "Stay where no one can see you." The servants obeyed without question, lowering their eyes whenever Grace passed through the halls wearing simple grey clothing instead of the elegant gowns reserved for respectable daughters. Everyone in the household knew the story. Grace had never answered the moon call. While every young wolf eventually awakened the spirit sleeping within, hers had remained silent. No glowing mark. No powerful scent. No dramatic transformation beneath the silver sky. Just silence. And in a kingdom where strength was admired above all else, silence had earned her a cruel name. Broken. Grace never argued. She simply continued helping in the kitchens, tending the gardens, mending torn blankets, and feeding abandoned animals that wandered onto the estate whenever winter storms rolled across the mountains. Her kindness was noticed only by creatures that asked for nothing in return. The morning of the royal moon rite arrived beneath a pale blue sky brushed with streaks of white clouds. Excitement spread through every neighboring pack because the Alpha King himself would appear before sunset. Alexander Wolf rarely left the royal capital, and when he did, entire territories treated the visit as history unfolding before their eyes. Every eligible daughter from respected families would gather inside Blackwood Hall, hoping fate, or perhaps simple luck, might change her future forever. Grace watched preparations through the kitchen window while polishing silver trays that would never belong in her hands once the celebration began. Outside, expensive carriages rolled across the stone courtyard one after another. Horses wore polished leather bridles trimmed with silver. Crimson banners fluttered in the crisp breeze. Servants hurried in every direction carrying flowers, crystal lanterns, and baskets overflowing with white roses. The entire estate seemed to glow with anticipation. "Don't even think about looking toward the ballroom," Margaret said sharply as she entered the kitchen without warning. "You'll remain behind the service corridor until every guest has left. If anyone asks, you're part of the staff. Nothing more." Vanessa smiled as she adjusted the sapphire necklace around her neck. "Imagine embarrassing father in front of the Alpha King," she said with a quiet laugh. "Thankfully, no one will know we're related." Grace lowered her eyes, not because she believed them anymore, but because arguing had never changed anything. She quietly folded the linen towel in her hands and nodded once. "Yes, Margaret studied her for another moment before stepping closer and brushing an invisible speck of dust from Grace's shoulder. "Remember your place." The words lingered long after both women disappeared down the hallway. Grace released a slow breath and glanced toward the small garden outside the kitchen. A tiny white songbird had become trapped beneath a stack of wooden crates, fluttering desperately without making much sound. Setting the polished tray aside, Grace hurried outside, carefully lifting each crate until the frightened bird finally found enough space to spread its wings. It rested for only a heartbeat on her fingertips before soaring into the bright afternoon sky. Grace smiled softly as she watched it disappear beyond the pine trees. For a brief moment, she imagined what freedom might feel like. She never noticed the pair of silver eyes watching from a distant carriage that had just entered the estate gates. Grace spent the next several hours moving quietly through corridors that seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Servants hurried across polished marble floors carrying silver platters, crystal glasses, and towering arrangements of white lilies whose sweet fragrance drifted through the entire estate. Every clock seemed to tick faster as sunset approached. Outside, elegant carriages continued arriving from neighboring packs, their polished wheels crunching across the gravel driveway while liveried attendants welcomed noble families with graceful bows. From behind the swinging kitchen doors, Grace could hear distant laughter, music from a string quartet, and the excited conversations of young women convinced that destiny might finally smile upon them before the evening ended. She wondered what it felt like to walk into a room believing the future belonged to you. Margaret made certain Grace would never have the chance to find out. Just before the first guests entered the grand ballroom, she handed Grace a plain black serving apron that covered nearly every inch of her faded grey dress. "You will remain in the western service corridor," Margaret instructed without looking directly at her. "If someone speaks to you, answer politely and leave immediately. You are invisible tonight." Vanessa smirked as she admired her reflection in a nearby mirror. Her emerald gown shimmered beneath the candlelight, every jewel carefully chosen to attract attention. "Do not worry," she said lightly. "No king notices shadows." Grace accepted the apron without protest. Years ago, words like those would have left an ache deep inside her heart. Now they settled quietly around her like the familiar winter air. She no longer expected kindness from people who had already decided who she was. Instead, she focused on the simple things she could still control. A steady breath. A gentle smile for exhausted servants. A helping hand whenever someone needed one. As twilight settled across the mountains, Blackwood Hall transformed into something almost magical. Hundreds of candles reflected from towering windows, filling the ballroom with warm golden light. Musicians filled the air with graceful melodies while noble families exchanged formal greetings beneath banners displaying the ancient crest of the Alpha King. Grace caught only brief glimpses through partially opened service doors as she carried trays between kitchens and dining rooms. Glittering gowns flowed across polished floors like streams of color. Distinguished alphas stood proudly beside their families. Young omegas practiced perfect smiles while pretending not to watch the enormous entrance doors every few seconds. Then everything became quiet. The music faded. Conversations stopped almost instantly. Even the servants paused where they stood. Grace felt it before she understood it. A strange stillness settled over the estate, followed by an almost electric awareness that someone extraordinary had arrived. Curious despite herself, she carefully stepped closer to the edge of the service hallway where a narrow opening offered a small view into the ballroom. Through the crowd she saw him for the first time. Alexander Wolf entered without ceremony, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit beneath a long midnight coat embroidered with silver thread. He did not raise his voice or demand attention. He did not need to. His calm presence filled the enormous room more completely than any speech ever could. Every noble lowered their head respectfully as he passed. His expression remained composed, almost unreadable, yet his silver eyes quietly observed everything around him. Grace immediately lowered her gaze, afraid even accidental eye contact might draw unwanted attention. She turned to continue toward the kitchens, balancing a polished silver tray across her arms. At that exact moment, one frightened young servant rushed around the corner too quickly, stumbling over the edge of a carpet. Without thinking, Grace reached forward, catching both the falling girl and the stack of fragile crystal glasses before either could crash onto the marble floor. The tray tilted sharply, and one tiny drop of blood appeared where the polished edge scraped across Grace's palm. She barely noticed it. Someone else did. The tiny crimson drop disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared, soaking into the white cloth wrapped around the edge of the silver tray. Grace quietly steadied the frightened servant before offering her a reassuring smile. "It is all right," she whispered. "Nothing broke." The young woman looked close to tears. "Thank you. I thought I was going to ruin everything." Grace gently adjusted the stack of crystal glasses back into place. "You did not ruin anything. Take a deep breath." The servant nodded gratefully and hurried away before anyone noticed the near accident. Grace flexed her sore hand once, then reached for a clean napkin to wrap around the shallow scrape. She had barely finished tying the cloth when an unfamiliar sensation swept across the ballroom. It was impossible to explain. The conversations had resumed only moments earlier, yet now another hush drifted through the air, quieter than before but somehow heavier. Grace slowly looked toward the grand entrance hall. Alexander Wolf had stopped walking. Surrounded by royal advisors and distinguished nobles, he stood perfectly still, his attention no longer on the receiving line arranged before him. Instead, His silver eyes had shifted almost imperceptibly toward the service corridor. Grace immediately stepped backward into the shadows, convinced she had imagined it. Why would the Alpha King notice someone like her? She lowered her head and resumed carrying the tray toward the dining hall. Behind her, whispers began moving through the guests like a breeze passing through tall grass. Several noble women exchanged puzzled glances after noticing the king's unusual pause. One elderly alpha quietly remarked that Alexander had always possessed extraordinary instincts, sensing details everyone else overlooked. No one dared question him aloud, but curiosity spread throughout the room. Meanwhile, Margaret welcomed influential families with flawless smiles, proudly presenting Vanessa as the jewel of the Miller household. Vanessa accepted every compliment with graceful confidence, carefully positioning herself wherever she believed the king's gaze might eventually fall. Neither of them realized his attention had already drifted elsewhere. Grace entered a smaller reception room where refreshments were being arranged before dinner. She placed the polished tray onto a long oak table and immediately noticed one of the floral centerpieces beginning to lean dangerously toward the edge. Without hesitation, she adjusted the vase before several delicate white roses slipped into a nearby candle. An older housekeeper observed the small gesture and smiled warmly. "You always notice what everyone else misses," she said softly. Grace offered an embarrassed smile. "Someone has to." The woman studied her for a moment. "Your grandmother was exactly the same." Before Grace could answer, the distant sound of ceremonial horns echoed through Blackwood Hall. Every guest gathered inside the grand ballroom for the official welcome. Servants were instructed to remain behind the walls unless called upon. Grace obediently stepped back into the service passage, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Hidden behind carved wooden screens, she could hear the master of ceremonies announcing the arrival of the royal delegation and thanking the gathered families for honoring the ancient moon rite. Alexander accepted the formal greetings with calm dignity, offering polite words but very few smiles. Even while speaking, however, something continued to pull gently at his instincts. It was not the perfume worn by noble daughters or the carefully rehearsed introductions echoing across the ballroom. It was quieter than that. Softer. Familiar in a way he could not explain. Like the first snowfall settling over a silent forest before dawn. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath the surface, not with urgency or aggression, but with quiet recognition. Alexander had learned long ago to trust that feeling. Somewhere inside Blackwood Hall, someone was trying very hard not to be seen. Grace remained behind the carved wooden screen while the formal introductions continued in the ballroom. From where she stood, she could only glimpse fragments of the celebration through the intricate patterns cut into the polished oak. She saw shimmering gowns gliding across the marble floor, heard the gentle clink of crystal glasses, and listened as respected families proudly announced the names of their daughters. One after another, hopeful smiles filled the room. One after another, Alexander Wolf greeted them with calm courtesy, yet the quiet distance in his silver eyes never seemed to fade. It was as though he was searching for something no one else could see. Grace kept reminding herself that the evening would soon end. By sunrise, the grand hall would return to silence, the noble guests would leave, and she would once again become invisible. That thought should have comforted her, yet for reasons she could not explain, an unfamiliar uneasiness settled over her heart. Across the ballroom, Alexander listened patiently as another influential alpha praised his daughter's accomplishments. She was graceful, intelligent, and admired throughout the Northern Territories. The young woman spoke confidently, her smile polished through years of preparation. Alexander responded with respectful kindness, but the strange feeling inside him only grew stronger. His wolf remained alert, not restless with impatience but quietly persistent, urging him to look beyond the carefully arranged spectacle unfolding before him. His closest advisor, Theodore Ashcroft, noticed the subtle shift in the king's attention. Leaning closer, he spoke in a low voice. "Your Majesty, is something troubling you?" Alexander answered without taking his eyes from the crowd. "No. Something is missing." Theodore followed his gaze across the ballroom but saw nothing unusual. The ceremony continued exactly as tradition demanded. Music played softly. Noble families exchanged pleasant conversation. Servants moved discreetly between tables. Everything appeared perfect. Yet Alexander trusted instincts that had guided him through countless difficult decisions. Somewhere nearby, an unseen thread continued pulling at his senses. At that moment, one of the younger kitchen servants hurried into the service corridor carrying a heavy tray of freshly baked pastries. She stumbled slightly as she rounded the corner, clearly overwhelmed by the pace of the evening. Grace stepped forward without hesitation. "Let me help you," she said gently, taking half the weight before the tray slipped from the girl's trembling hands. "Thank you," the servant whispered with visible relief. "Everyone is so nervous tonight." Grace smiled warmly. "Then we should help each other stay calm." Together they carried the tray toward the banquet entrance. Before stepping inside, Grace quietly adjusted the girl's collar and brushed a trace of flour from her sleeve. "There," she said. "Now no one will know you were rushing." The servant laughed softly, her anxious expression finally easing. Unaware of the small moment unfolding behind the doors, Margaret continued introducing Vanessa to prominent guests. Vanessa's confident laughter floated through the ballroom as she accepted compliments with practiced elegance. More than once, Margaret subtly guided conversations toward the possibility of a royal match, convinced that fortune favored those bold enough to pursue it. Neither woman noticed Alexander glance away from them once again. Just as the banquet attendants prepared to enter, a gentle breeze drifted through the open terrace doors, carrying with it the fresh scent of pine after rain and something softer that seemed almost impossible to describe. Alexander stopped mid-conversation. Every instinct inside him fell completely silent for a single heartbeat before settling into absolute certainty. The feeling was no longer distant. It was close. Very close. Beyond the polished smiles, beyond the noble introductions, beyond the glittering center of the celebration, someone with a remarkably gentle heart was standing quietly in the shadows, believing no one would ever come looking for her. Grace balanced the banquet tray carefully as she stepped through the side entrance, keeping her eyes lowered the way she had been taught since childhood. The ballroom shimmered beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers, their warm light reflecting from polished marble and silver decorations until the entire hall seemed wrapped in moonlight. Laughter drifted through the room, accompanied by soft music and the quiet murmur of conversations between powerful families. Grace moved silently along the outer edge of the gathering, placing glasses onto tables with practiced precision before retreating once more toward the servants' corridor. She believed she had escaped everyone's notice. She was wrong. Alexander Wolf had stopped listening to the conversation unfolding beside him. The subtle fragrance carried on the evening breeze had returned, gentle as fresh pine after spring rain, impossible to confuse with expensive perfumes filling the ballroom. His wolf responded with calm certainty instead of restless urgency. This was not excitement. It was recognition. Theodore noticed the king's attention shift again. "Your Majesty," he asked quietly. Alexander answered without looking away. "Who is serving the western side of the hall tonight?" Theodore glanced across the room. "Only household staff, as far as I know." Alexander nodded thoughtfully but remained silent. Something about the presence hidden among the servants refused to leave his mind. Across the ballroom, Margaret noticed the king's distant expression and misunderstood it completely. Believing he simply had not yet met the right family, she gently guided Vanessa closer to the royal delegation during the next formal greeting. Vanessa offered a graceful curtsy, speaking with polished confidence about the traditions of the Northern Territories and the honor of welcoming the Alpha King to the Miller estate. She was elegant, well-prepared, and admired by everyone nearby. Alexander treated her with the same respectful courtesy he offered every guest, but his attention drifted beyond her almost immediately. His eyes moved toward the edge of the ballroom just as Grace quietly knelt to retrieve a folded linen napkin that had slipped beneath a serving table. She did not realize that an elderly guest had accidentally dropped a silver cane while trying to stand. Before anyone else reacted, Grace gently set her tray aside, picked up the cane, and offered it back with both hands. "Take your time, sir," she said with a warm smile. "There is no hurry." The elderly Alpha accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, child." Most people only notice those standing in the center of the room. Grace smiled softly. Sometimes the people on the edges need help first. She excused herself before he could ask her name. Alexander had witnessed the entire exchange from across the ballroom. The words were simple, yet they lingered in the quiet corners of his thoughts long after Grace disappeared behind another group of guests. There had been no performance in her kindness, no expectation of praise, only quiet compassion offered as naturally as breathing. Theodore followed the king's gaze and finally noticed the young servant vanishing into the service corridor. "Would you like me to ask who she is?" he whispered. Alexander did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained fixed on the empty doorway where Grace had disappeared. For reasons he could not fully explain, the grand ceremony, the noble introductions, and every carefully arranged presentation suddenly seemed far less important than discovering the name of the woman who believed she belonged in the shadows while carrying more quiet grace than anyone standing beneath the brightest lights. The questions Alexander had quietly carried since entering Blackwood Hall no longer felt like passing curiosity. They settled deeper with every small moment he witnessed. The young servant never searched for attention, never lingered where important guests could notice her, and never accepted praise for the kindness that seemed to follow her wherever she walked. While others carefully displayed their accomplishments beneath the chandeliers, she disappeared into the background as soon as her work was finished. That contrast lingered in his thoughts more than any polished introduction offered throughout the evening. Theodore noticed the thoughtful expression on the king's face and spoke once the latest round of formal greetings had concluded. "Your Majesty, if you wish, I can have the household steward bring every servant forward. It would only take a few minutes." Alexander slowly shook his head. "No. If she has spent years avoiding attention, forcing her into the center of the room would only frighten her." Theodore studied him with quiet surprise. The Alpha King was known for decisive leadership, yet tonight every decision seemed guided by unusual patience. Before he could respond, the Master of Ceremonies announced that the families would soon gather for the traditional moon blessing, the oldest ritual of the evening. Guests gracefully moved toward the center of the ballroom while musicians lowered their instruments and servants hurried to clear the remaining refreshment tables. Grace carried another silver tray toward the western corridor, hoping to finish before the ceremony began. She preferred working while everyone else focused on the celebration. As she rounded the corner, she noticed a little girl standing alone beside one of the towering marble columns. The child could not have been older than 7. Her bright blue ribbon had come loose, and she looked close to tears while searching the crowded ballroom for her parents. Grace immediately knelt beside her. "Did you lose someone?" she asked gently. The little girl nodded. "I cannot find my mother." Grace smiled warmly. "Then let us make sure your mother can find you." She carefully retied the ribbon, smoothing the child's hair with patient hands before lifting her onto a nearby bench where she could be seen more easily above the crowd. "Stay right here. Someone who loves you is already looking." Less than a minute later, an anxious woman hurried through the gathering and embraced the little girl with grateful relief. "Thank you," she said, her eyes shining. "I only looked away for a moment." Grace simply nodded. She was very brave. She quietly picked up her tray and slipped back toward the service hallway before either of them could ask another question. None of them realized that Alexander had witnessed the entire exchange from across the ballroom. There had been no hesitation, no expectation of recognition, only gentle compassion offered to a frightened child. His wolf became completely still, as though every uncertain instinct from earlier had suddenly found its answer. At that same moment, Margaret noticed Grace retreating from the family gathering and felt a wave of irritation. She crossed the room quickly, keeping her voice low enough that nearby guests would not hear. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded. "I told you to stay completely out of sight." Grace lowered her eyes. "The child needed help." Margaret frowned. "That is not your concern. Your only responsibility tonight is making certain no one mistakes you for a member of this family." Grace quietly accepted the words without argument, but someone standing only a few yards away heard every single one. Alexander slowly turned toward the sharp voice, and for the first time that evening, his calm expression changed. Not into anger, but into unmistakable resolve. Grace lowered her eyes after Margaret's sharp words, expecting the familiar silence that always followed. Instead, an unexpected voice broke through the quiet gathering. "Excuse me." It was calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. Every nearby conversation faded as Alexander Wolf stepped away from the royal delegation. His measured footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor until he stopped only a few feet from Grace. Margaret's confident expression disappeared beneath visible surprise. She immediately offered a graceful bow. "Your Majesty, I apologize if there has been any inconvenience. She is only a servant helping for the evening." Alexander did not answer her immediately. His attention remained entirely on Grace. She stood motionless, her hands folded neatly before her, clearly uncomfortable being noticed by anyone, much less the Alpha King himself. The small bandage around her palm caught his attention. "Your hand is injured," he said gently. Grace instinctively hid it behind the serving tray. "It is only a small scrape, Your Majesty. I am perfectly fine." Alexander noticed she spoke without bitterness or self-pity. Even now, she seemed more concerned about causing trouble than receiving help. Theodore quietly watched from several steps away, recognizing the unusual warmth in the king's voice. Guests throughout the ballroom began exchanging curious whispers. Why would the Alpha King interrupt the ceremony to speak with an unknown servant? Margaret recovered quickly, forcing another polite smile. "She has always been different," she explained carefully. "Our family prefers that she remains out of the way during important occasions." Alexander slowly turned toward her. "Different?" Margaret hesitated before replying. "She never developed as other young women did. She cannot answer the moon call. People have misunderstood her for years." Vanessa stepped forward with practiced confidence. "We only wish to protect our family's reputation, Your Majesty." Alexander listened without interrupting. Then he looked back at Grace. "Is that what you wish?" Grace seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Your Majesty, do you wish to remain hidden?" The ballroom became so quiet that even the musicians lowered their instruments completely. Grace searched for an answer she had never been asked before. For years everyone had told her where she belonged. No one had ever cared what she wanted. After several long seconds she answered honestly, "I only try not to become a burden to anyone." Something softened in Alexander's expression. Those words carried no resentment, only quiet acceptance learned through many lonely years. At that moment the elderly Alpha whose cane Grace had returned earlier stepped forward from the crowd. "If I may speak, Your Majesty." Alexander nodded. "Please do." The old gentleman smiled kindly toward Grace. "This young woman has helped more people tonight than most of us realized. She expected nothing in return. I believe kindness deserves to be seen." Almost immediately, the anxious mother whose little daughter Grace had comforted stepped beside him. "She found my child before I could. She brought peace to a frightened little girl when everyone else was occupied." Then the young kitchen servant spoke with unexpected courage. "She saved me from dropping the banquet service earlier. She never made me feel foolish." One quiet voice became another, and then another. Small stories began rising from every corner of the ballroom. Grace listened in stunned silence as strangers described simple moments she had already forgotten. She had never considered any of them extraordinary. Alexander looked around the room before returning his gaze to Grace. "Interesting," he said softly. "The woman your family tried so hard to keep unseen seems to be the one everyone remembers." Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but because for the first time in her life, people were speaking about her with kindness instead of pity. And somewhere deep inside Alexander's soul, the certainty he had quietly carried all evening settled into something that could no longer be ignored. No one spoke for several long seconds after the final voice faded into silence. Grace stood at the center of the ballroom holding the empty serving tray, overwhelmed by the realization that people had noticed her kindness even when she believed she had been invisible. Margaret's composed smile had grown noticeably strained, while Vanessa struggled to understand how the evening had slipped beyond her careful plans. Every pair of eyes now rested on the quiet young woman they had barely acknowledged when the celebration began. Alexander took one slow step closer, his expression remaining calm but unmistakably sincere. "Grace Miller," he said, speaking her name for the first time. She looked up in surprise. She had never told him who she was. Theodore answered the unspoken question with a respectful smile. The household steward quietly confirmed your name a few moments ago, Miss Miller. Grace lowered her eyes again, suddenly embarrassed by the unexpected attention. Alexander noticed the discomfort immediately. You do not seem comfortable standing before so many people. Grace answered honestly. I have never had a reason to. A gentle murmur spread through the guests. There was no bitterness in her voice, only simple truth. Alexander glanced around the ballroom before addressing everyone present. Tonight I have listened to many introductions. I have heard families speak proudly about titles, accomplishments, traditions, and noble bloodlines. Yet the stories that remained with me were not about status. They were about compassion offered without expecting recognition. His words echoed softly beneath the crystal chandeliers. Strength can command attention. Character earns trust. The elderly Alpha nodded thoughtfully. Several guests quietly agreed. Margaret stepped forward, determined to recover the evening. Your Majesty, Grace has always been fragile. She has never possessed the gifts expected of our people. Alexander turned toward her without losing his calm demeanor. What gifts do you believe matter most? Margaret hesitated. Power. Reputation. A strong wolf. Alexander allowed a brief silence to settle over the room before answering. Then perhaps we have been measuring strength too narrowly. He looked back at Grace. I have watched you throughout this evening. You helped frightened servants, comforted a lost child, assisted an elderly guest, and expected nothing in return. You acted the same way whether anyone was watching or not. That is a rare kind of strength. Grace felt warmth rise to her cheeks. No one had ever spoken about her that way before. She searched for words but found none. Theodore quietly stepped beside the king. Your Majesty, the moon blessing is waiting. Alexander nodded, then surprised everyone by extending his hand toward Grace. He did not command her. He simply offered the choice. Would you walk with me? Grace stared at the outstretched hand in disbelief. Me? Yes, Alexander replied with a gentle smile. Only if you wish to. For the first time in many years, Grace realized the decision belonged entirely to her. Slowly, almost timidly, she placed her hand in his. The ballroom remained completely silent as Alexander guided her toward the center of the great hall. No royal announcement was made. No ancient magic flashed across the room. The moment needed none of those things. Every guest understood its meaning without a single dramatic gesture. The woman hidden behind service doors only an hour earlier now walked beside the Alpha King with quiet dignity. Margaret could only watch in stunned silence as years of shame dissolved beneath a single act of genuine respect. And somewhere beyond the towering windows, the moon emerged from behind the clouds, bathing Blackwood Hall in soft silver light, as though the night itself had been waiting for someone to finally see what had been precious all along. Grace stood beside Alexander beneath the gentle silver light pouring through the towering windows, still unable to believe that the hand she held had been offered by choice rather than obligation. Around them, the ballroom remained remarkably quiet, not because anyone had been ordered into silence, but because every guest sensed they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the candles burned out. Alexander slowly released Grace's hand only so she could stand comfortably beside him instead of behind him. It was a small gesture, yet everyone noticed it. He was not placing her in the shadow of his authority. He was inviting her to stand as his equal before the room. The master of ceremonies hesitated, uncertain whether to continue the traditional moon blessing. Alexander spared him the decision. Please continue, he said warmly. Tonight's tradition should remind us why it exists. The elderly official nodded gratefully and began the ancient blessing that celebrated wisdom, compassion, courage, and hope as the true foundations of every enduring pact. As the words echoed through Blackwood Hall, Grace realized something extraordinary. For years she had believed she lacked the qualities that mattered most because everyone measured her by gifts she had never possessed. Yet the blessing never mentioned power alone. It honored hearts that protected others, hands that served without reward, and people who chose kindness when no one expected it. Quiet tears gathered in Grace's eyes, not from sorrow but from relief. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt as though she had failed simply by being herself. When the blessing ended, Alexander addressed the gathering one final time. "Every generation inherits traditions," he said. "Our responsibility is not only to preserve them, but also to remember why they were created. If we allow pride to blind us to quiet goodness, then we fail those traditions ourselves." His silver eyes briefly met Margaret's before returning to the assembled guests. No person should ever be hidden because they do not resemble someone else's expectations. Margaret lowered her head, unable to answer. Vanessa stood silently beside her, her confidence replaced by thoughtful reflection. Neither woman was publicly humiliated. Instead, they were left to face a truth that no accusation could have expressed more clearly. Alexander then turned toward Grace with the same calm sincerity she had seen throughout the evening. "Miss Miller, if you are willing, I would like to invite you to visit Blackwood Castle as an honored guest. There is no obligation attached to my invitation. I simply believe conversations are better shared with people whose character has already earned respect." Grace blinked in astonishment. "You are giving me a choice." Alexander smiled gently. "Everyone deserves that." She looked around the ballroom one last time. Earlier that evening she had believed the safest place in the world was behind a closed service door. Now she understood that hiding had never protected her heart. It had only hidden her light from those who might have recognized it. With quiet confidence that surprised even herself, Grace nodded. "I would be honored." Warm applause gradually filled the great hall, not loud or triumphant, but sincere. Outside, the white songbird Grace had freed that afternoon settled briefly upon the stone balcony before lifting effortlessly into the moonlit sky. She watched it disappear above the ancient pines and smiled. Perhaps her grandmother had been right all those years ago. Some people were never broken. They had simply been waiting for someone willing to see them clearly. And on that unforgettable night, everything changed not because destiny suddenly created Grace's worth, but because the truth of it had finally been seen.